The war had ended, at least that's what the radio said. But on the forgotten islands of the Pacific, the silence that followed was more terrifying than the bombs. In the shattered village of Saipan, Japanese women waited in the ruins, clutching their children and knives hidden beneath torn kimonos. For months they'd been told what capture meant. The Americans will come for your bodies. They will take your honor. Death is mercy. Posters screamed it. Soldiers repeated it. Even mothers whispered it to daughters before vanishing into the jungle. So when the foreign voices finally echoed down the valley, rough, unfamiliar, and getting closer, the women didn't think of survival. They thought of shame. They thought of death. One mother whispered, "Better the blade than their hands." And as the door burst open, sunlight and shadow collided, and everything they'd been taught about monsters was about to be tested. There were no heroes left on Tashima, only ghosts that still obeyed the wind. The jungle had gone quiet, and the smoke from burned fields drifted over broken roofs. The villagers, mostly women and children, had not seen a Japanese soldier in weeks. They heard only the sea, the wind, and sometimes at night the sound of boots far away. Inside the crumbling remains of a fish-drying hut, 20 women hid together. They had sealed the door with planks and stones, breathing in the dark, clutching, their children close. The air smelled of salt and fear. No one spoke above a whisper. Every sound outside made them flinch. For months, they had heard the same warnings. The Americans take everything. They will strip your honor, they will not let you live. The old posters nailed to the temple wall said the same. Better to die pure than live in shame. The women had believed it. They had even prepared. One carried poison hidden in her sleeve. Another had tied a short knife to her thigh. If capture came, they would not be taken breathing. Then came the footsteps. At first faint like the tapping of rain, then heavier, deliberate, closer. Voices, foreign, loud, sharp. The women pressed themselves against the walls. A child whimpered, and her mother clamped a hand over her mouth. Someone began to pray under her breath. The latch snapped. The door creaked open. Sunlight flooded the room, slicing through the dust. A tall figure stood in the doorway, a helmet shadowing his eyes. His uniform was foreign. Brown fabric, strange insignia, the smell of metal and sweat. Behind him, others spread out into the square, rifles low but ready. No one screamed. No one moved. The man spoke, short bursts of words in a language none of them understood. The women stared, waiting for the moment they had rehearsed. The grabbing hands, the tearing clothes, the shame that would erase everything they had been told to protect. It didn't come. The soldier repeated his words, slower this time, then turned to a local interpreter, a trembling man captured days earlier. "You are prisoners," the translator stammered. "You will not be hurt. Stay together. You will be given food." The women did not believe him. Lies, they thought. Tricks. Before cruelty. But then one soldier stepped forward. Not close, only far enough to place a bucket on the ground. He backed away. Another set down a crate and opened it with his knife. Inside were cans of something that smelled faintly sweet. The interpreter motioned toward them. "For you. Eat." No one moved. Finally, an older mother reached forward, shaking, so hard her hand rattled the tin cup. She scooped a bit of water, drank, and waited for pain. None came. Another woman picked up a can, sniffed it, and pressed a spoon to her child's lips. The boy swallowed, then smiled faintly. The soldiers just stood there watching, silent. Not a word, not a laugh, not a gesture that crossed the invisible line between them. And then the tears came. Women who had not wept through weeks of bombing began to sob, quietly, as if afraid mercy itself might vanish if they made too much noise. That night the captives were led out of the hut. The air smelled of wet earth and smoke. The soldiers guided them to an open clearing near the beach. A makeshift fence of barbed wire surrounded several tents. The women were told to sleep there. As darkness fell, blankets were brought, folded, neatly laid in a pile at the gate. The soldiers didn't hand them over, they simply placed them down and stepped back. One by one, the women crept forward, taking the blankets like thieves stealing warmth. Still, none were touched. None were even approached. They waited for the demand that always followed kindness, the price. But the night passed in silence. The men posted at the perimeter, facing outward, not inward. "Why don't they look at us?" whispered a girl barely out of her teens. Her mother didn't answer. She only held her tighter. The question spread like smoke. Why don't they
touch us?
Inside, guilt tangled with relief. Everything they had been told screamed that this calm was a lie. Perhaps they were being fattened for humiliation. Perhaps mercy was just the first act of cruelty. But the pattern didn't change. At dawn, water was brought again, then rice, then a wooden box filled with bandages and small bottles marked with English letters. One soldier, young, nervous, handed a folded cloth to the interpreter. "For washing," he said. The interpreter relayed the words in broken Japanese. "Soap, for you, for you." The women looked at each other. None reached out. Finally, one mother, trembling but desperate, took the soap, rubbed it between her hands, and began to wash her child's face. The boy giggled, splashing water. The sound startled everyone. Laughter hadn't been heard in that camp since the war began. The soldiers turned away. That night, under the stars, one woman, the oldest among them, took a piece of cloth from her sleeve and burned charcoal from the fire to write her thoughts. "We were told to die before capture. We expected them to strip our honor. Instead, they gave us food and turned away their eyes. I do not understand this kindness. It frightens me more than death." Days passed. The women were moved from the clearing to a larger camp deeper inland. The journey began at dawn. They walked barefoot, carrying bundles tied with frayed rope, children slung across their backs. The guards stayed behind and beside them, rifles slung but never raised. Every step felt like walking toward judgment. Rumors spread through the line. "This is where it ends. This is where they'll take what they want." Mothers whispered prayers. Daughters lowered their eyes. But when they reached the new camp, the nightmare they imagined dissolved into confusion again. Wooden huts, a Red Cross flag painted on a tent, men and women separated into different enclosures. Buckets of clean water lined up neatly, piles of rice, fruit, even bananas, something most children hadn't seen since before the war. The children squealed. With delight, the mothers froze. Mercy still looked like a trap. "Don't touch it," one woman hissed. "They'll take it back when they take us." But the pattern didn't change. Day after day, soldiers delivered food and stood aside. They escorted the women to the well but stayed a pace behind. They handed over soap, brushes, even small towels, then turned their backs. The shock of absence grew heavier than fear. Then one afternoon, a medical officer entered with 2 nurses. Through the interpreter, he said, "We will check the health of children and mothers. Anyone sick will receive medicine." The women froze again. Medicine? From them? But when a child began to cough, the officer knelt beside her. His hands were steady, his voice quiet. He listened to her chest, frowned, then handed a bottle of syrup to her mother. "For her," he said softly. The mother bowed, tears spilling down her cheeks. She whispered, "Our own soldiers told us to die. These men tell us to live." That night, the camp was quieter than usual. The waves crashed in the distance. The women gathered around the small fire. One of the younger girls, barely 18, hugged her knees and whispered, "If this is mercy, why does it hurt to believe it?" No one answered. The next day, another surprise came. A soldier entered the enclosure carrying paper and pencils. The interpreter announced, "You may write to your families. The Red Cross will send your letters." For a moment, silence. Then, disbelief. "Letters?" someone murmured. "We are prisoners. Who would listen?" Still, the papers were passed around. One by one, trembling hands began to write names, fragments of prayers, words that felt like ghosts returning. A young woman named Hannah bent over her page. Her tears fell onto the ink. "Mother, I thought I would die in shame. But I am alive. They feed us. They do not touch us. Perhaps you will see my face again." When the soldiers collected the letters, they bowed slightly before leaving. That gesture, small, foreign, absurdly respectful, broke something inside them. For the first time, the women began to talk not about what might happen, but why nothing had happened. The older woman who had written on cloth whispered, "Maybe their God watches them." Another replied bitterly, "Or maybe they're waiting until we trust them." But her voice shook. As weeks passed, the same pattern held. Guards at the fence, food at sunrise, medicine when needed. And silence. Always silence. The women began to sense something else beneath it. Exhaustion. The soldiers' faces were not cruel but tired. Their eyes were not hungry but hollow. They were men who had seen too much death to want any more of it. The women realized that these were not demons come to conquer. They were humans trying to remember how to be kind again. And that realization frightened them more than any nightmare. Because if the enemy could show mercy, then everything they'd been taught about purity, honor, and death began to crumble. At dusk one evening, Hannah approached the fence where a soldier stood watch. She bowed slightly and said, "Why do you not hate us?" The man didn't understand. The interpreter hesitated, then translated her words. The soldier looked at her for a long moment. His reply was simple. "War is over." Then he turned away. That night, Hannah wrote again on a scrap of paper. "The greatest shock is not cruelty. It is restraint. We expected them to take everything, but they gave us back our dignity. Perhaps mercy is the hardest thing to survive." Weeks later, word of Japan's formal surrender reached the camp. The women expected chaos, anger, retribution, violence. Instead, the same quiet routine continued. Meals at dawn, guards at dusk. No cruelty, no commands. The war had ended again, this time inside them. They had been taught to die before, dishonor. But on the island of Tashima, they learned something their teachers never spoke of, that sometimes the truest act of power is choosing not to harm. By the final weeks of summer 1945, the war's end drifted through the camps like a rumor no one dared to trust. The surrender was spoken of in fragments, whispered by interpreters, confirmed by letters, carried on the radio waves that the prisoners could not hear. Yet for the women of Tashima, peace did not feel like freedom. It felt like waiting. Would they be sent home, forgotten, punished anew under a different name? The Americans said little. Their routines never changed. Meals delivered with quiet precision, patrols taken with eyes turned respectfully aside, doctors making their rounds with measured hands. The days blurred together until the silence itself became a kind of language. Night, the women spoke softly in the dark. They confessed what had once seemed unthinkable. We were not harmed, not once. No hands reached for them, no jeers, no threats, no cruelty. The absence of what they had feared most became the wound that healed and bewildered them all at once. Hannah, the young woman who had once written a trembling letter to her mother, received a message one morning through the Red Cross. The envelope was worn, the ink smudged from travel. She opened it with shaking fingers. "My daughter," it read. "The neighbors said you were gone. I prayed you would die before dishonor. But now I thank the heavens you live. I will never again believe what fear taught me to believe." The words struck her harder than any blow. Hannah pressed the letter to her heart, sobbing openly, surrounded by women who murmured prayers of disbelief and relief. If one letter had reached, perhaps others had too. Perhaps home still existed somewhere beyond the sea. That evening, under a pale moon, Sachiko, the elder who had become their quiet guide, gathered the younger women around the fire. Her voice trembled, but her gaze was steady. "We were told that capture was worse than death," she said. "We were told these men would destroy us, but they did not. They gave us water when we thirsted, food when we starved, silence when we trembled. They guarded us not as spoils, but as people. Do not forget this." Her words broke something open. In the group, a mixture of grief, relief, and disbelief so deep it left them speechless. When the orders for release finally arrived in September, few cheered. They packed their meager belongings in silence, scraps of cloth, bars of soap, folded letters, and were escorted to the shore. The soldiers did not speak much. They only nodded, saluted, and helped the women onto the boats. The sea was calm that day, as if holding its breath. Hannah clutched her sister's hand. "I was afraid to live among them," she whispered, "but I think I am more afraid to go home." The voyage back to Japan was eerily quiet. The air smelled of salt and memory. Waves broke against the hull in slow rhythm, each one echoing a thought none dared to speak. What will we be when we return? When they finally stepped onto Japanese soil, it was not the homeland they remembered. Cities lay flattened, families scattered, temples reduced to stone and ash. They had come back to a nation defeated in body and pride. Yet the women carried something rare, a story they did not know how to tell. How could they explain that? The men they were taught to fear had shown them restraint instead of cruelty. That mercy, not violence, had left the deepest scar. Many kept their silence for years, afraid no one would believe them. Others buried the truth inside diaries or whispered it to daughters in quiet kitchens long after the world had moved on. Hannah wrote in hers, "The Americans never touched us. That is the memory that will outlive the bombs. I met men who were tired of war, who chose not to cross the line they could have. I will remember that choice more than anything else." Sachiko, much older now, would tell her granddaughter decades later, "I begged God to let me die before shame found me. But when the soldiers came, they gave us blankets and turned their eyes away. That was the day I learned that mercy can be more terrifying than cruelty, because it forces you to question everything you believed about good and evil." Historians would go on to measure that war in tonnage and bomb counts in the rise and fall of cities. But for those women, the true history lived in silence, in the quiet refusal of men to become monsters, in the invisible boundary that was never crossed. Years later, as Japan rebuilt and laughter returned to its streets, a few of those women still kept their old Red Cross letters folded between the pages of worn prayer books. They remembered not the explosions, not the fire, not even the surrender, but the stillness that followed. For them, the most astonishing legacy of war was not destruction. It was restraint, not the violence they endured, but the mercy they never expected. Subscribe for more untold stories of courage, kindness, and contradiction. The moments history books forgot, but hearts never did.